Hi friends, continuing to the channel The World Without Us. By marrying its queen, Jelolia have united Poland and its Duchy of Lithuania into European power. The sculpture portrays him on the horseback following his victory at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410. Triumphant, he hoists two swords captured from the Poland's latest vanishly enemy, the Teutonic Knights of the Cross. In 1939, however, the Poles weren't faring so well against some descendants of these Teutonic Knights. Before the New York World's Fair ended, Hitler Nazis have taken a Poland and the sculptures couldn't be returned to its homeland. 6 sad years later, the Polish government gave it to New York as a symbol of its courageous, battered survivors. The statue of an Jailog was placed in the Central Park overlooking what today it is called as Turtle Pond. When Dr. Eric Sanderson leads a tour through the park, he and his flocks usually pass Jailio without pausing because they are lost in another centuries altogether. The 17th, benefited under his wide brimmed felt hat and trim beard, carrying around his chin and a laptop jammed in his backpack. Sanderson is a landscape ecologist with the Wildlife Conservation Society, a global squadron of research trying to save an imperial world from itself. At his Bronx Zoo headquarters, Sanderson directs the Mahanta Project, an attempt to recreate virtually Mahadan Island as it was when Henry Hudson's crew first saw it in 1609, a pre-urban vision that attempts speculation about how a postman future might look. His team has scored original Dutch documents, colonial British military maps, topographic surveys, and centuries of assorted archives throughout the town. They have probed the sediments, analyzed fossil pollens, and flagged thousands of bits of biological data into imagining the software that generates three-dimensional panoramas of the heavily wooded wilderness on which a metropolis was juxtaposed, in which new entry of a species of a grass or a tree that is historically conformed in some parts of the city. The image grew more detailed, more startling, more convincing. The goal is a block by the city block guide to this ghost forest, the one Eric Sanderson uncannily seems to see even while dogging Fifth Avenue buses. When Sanderson wandered through the Central Parks, he is able to look beyond the 500,000 cubic yards of a soil altered in by its designer, Frederick Law Allstate, and Cavlet walks to fill in what was mostly a swampy bog surrounded by the poison oak and sumac. He can trace the shoreline of the long, narrow lake that lay along what is now the 59th Street, north of an Plaza Hotel, with its tidal outlet that meandered through a salt marsh to the East River. From the west, he can see a pair of streams entering the lake that drained the slope of an Mahananda's major ridgeline, a deer, and a mountain lion known today as Broadway. Eric Sanderson sees water flowing everywhere in the town, much of it bubbling from the underground, which is how Spring Street got its name. He is identified more than 40 brooks and a stream that transferred was what was once a hilly, rocky island in the Algonium tongue of its first human occupants. The Lenays, Mahananthas refused to those now vanished hills. When New York's 19th century planners imposed a grid on everything north of an Greenwich village, the jumble of the original street to the south being impossible to the unrational that behaved as if the topography were irrelevant, except for some massive unmovable shits outcrops in Central Park and the island's northern tip. Mahananthas extruded territine was squashed and dumped into the stream beds, then placed and leveled to receive the advancing city. Thank you. Later, new contour arose, this time routed through rectilinear form and the hard angles, much as the water that once sculptured the island's land was now forced underground through a lattice of pipes. Eric Sanderson's Mahantha project have plotted now closely the modern Swiss system follows the old water sources, although man-made sewers lines can't pick away runoff efficiently as nature. In a city that buried its river, he observes rain still falls, it has to go somewhere. As it's happened, that will be the key to the breathing Mahananda's hard shell if nature's set about dismantling it. It would begin very quickly with the first strike at the city's most vulnerable spot, its underbelly. New York City Transit, Paul Schubert and Peter Bifra, a superintendent of the Hydrosolis and the level 1 maintenance superior of Hydrosolis emergency response, respectively, understand perfectly how this would work. Every day, they must keep 13 million gallons of water from overpowering New York's subway tunnels. That's just the water they have already underground, notes the Schubert. When it's rained, the amount is Bifra shows his palm. Surrounding it is incalculable. Maybe not actually incalculable, but it doesn't rain anyways, less now than before the city was built. Once Manhattan was 27 square miles of a porous ground interlaced with a living root that siphoned the 47.2 inches of average annual rainfall up trees and its meadow grasses, which dark there fill and exalt the rest back into the atmosphere. Whatever the roots didn't take settle into the island's water table. In places, it surfaced in the lakes and marshes with an excess draining off to the ocean via those 40 streams which now lie excess draining off to the oceans via those 40 streams which now lie trapped beneath concentrate and assaults. Today, because there is little soil to absorb rainfall or vegetation to transpire it, and because buildings block sunlight from evaporating it. Rain collects its puddles or follow the gravity down skewers, or it flows into the subway vents, adding to the water already down there. Below 131st Street and Lenox Avenue, for example, a rise underground river is corroding the bottom of A, B, C, and the D subway lines. Constantly, men in refluxing west and dinin rough outs like a scubbers and briefa or clambering around beneath the city to deal with the fact that under New York groundwater is always rising. Whenever it rains hard, sewage clog with a storm debris. The number of the plastic garbages bag adrift in the world's city may truly exceed calculations, and the water needing to go somewhere pops down the nearest subway stairs. As the nor'easter and the shirring Atlantic Ocean banks again the New York water table until in the place like the water states in the lower Manhattan or Yankee Stadium in the Bronx. It's back up right into the tunnel, shutting everything down until it subsides. Should the ocean continue to warm and rise even faster than the current inch per decade, at some point it simply won't subside. Shoulders and the briefer have no idea what will happen then. Add to all that the 1930s vintage water mains that frequency burst, and the only thing that has kept New York from flooding already, it is in intensity violence of its subway groove and 753 pumps. Thinks about those pumps. New York's subway system, an engineering marvel in 1903, was laid underneath an already existing burgeoning city, as that the city already here had sewer lines. The only place for subways to go was below them. So explains the scrubber, we have to pump uphill. In this, New York is not alone. Cities like London, Moscow, Washington builds their subways far deeper, often to double as the bomb shelters. Therein lies much potential disasters. Shading his eyes with his white hard hat, Scrubber peers down into an square pit beneath the Van Sillen Avenue station in Brooklyn, where each minute 650 gallons of natural groundwater gush from the bedrock. Gesturing over the roaring cascade, he indicates 4 submersible cast iron pumps that takes runs, laboring against the gravity to stay ahead. Such pumps runs on electricity. When the power fails, things can get difficulty very waste. Following the World Trade Center attack, an emergency pump train bearing a jumbo portable diesel generator pumped out 27 times the volume of an Shea Stadium. Had the Hudson River actually burst through the path train tunnel that connects New York subway to New Jersey, as was greatly feared, the pump trains, and possibly much of the city would simply have been overwhelmed. In an abounding city, there would be no one like an Paul Scrubber and Peter Briffa to race from the station to flooded station whenever more than 2 inches of rainfall, as happens lately with an disturbing frequency, sometimes snacking hose ups, stairways to pump to and sweeter down the street. Sometimes navigating these tunnels in inflate boats. With no people, there would also be no power. The pumps will go off and stay off. When this pumps facility shuts down, says Scubber, in half an hour, water reaches a level where the train can't pass anymore. Brifa removes his safety goggles and rubs his eyes. A flood in one zone would push water into the others. Within 36 hours, the whole thing could fill. Even if it weren't raining, with the subway pumps still, that would have no more than a couple of a day that esteemed. At that point, water would start curling away soil under the pavement. Before the long streets starts to crater, with no one uncalling sewers, some new water sources forms on the surface. Others appears suddenly as an waterlogged subway ceilings collapse. Within 20 years, the water-soaked steel columns that support the street above the east side 4, 5 and 6 trains corrode and buckle. As Legiston's Avenue caves in, it becomes a river. Well before then, however, pavements all over the town would have already been in trouble. According to Dr. Jamil Ahmed, chairman of the Civil Engineering Department at the New York Cooper Union, things will begin to fall apart during the first month of the March after the humans vacate Manhattan. Each March, temperatures normally flutters back and forth around 32 degree Fahrenheit as many as 40 times. Presumably, the climate changes could push this back to February. Whenever it is, the repeated freezing and thawing makes an asphalt and cement spilled. When show the thaws, water seeps into these fresh cracks. When it freezes, the water expands and cracks widen. Call it water irritations for being squashed under all that cityscape. Almost every other compound in nature contracts when frozen, but H2O molecules do the opposite, organizing themselves into an elegant hexagonal crystal that takes up about 9% more space than they did when sloshing around its liquid state. Pretty six-sided crystals suggested snowflakes, so Gossamer it hard to convince of them pushing apart slabs of sidewalks. It Gaussmakers it hard to conceive of them pushing apart slabs of sidewalks. It's even more difficult to imagine the carbon steel water pipe to build within stand 7,500 pounds of pressure per square inch exploding when they freeze. Yet that actually what happens. As pavement separates, weeds like mustards, shamrocks and the goosegrass blows in from the central park and works their way down the new cracks, which widen the further in the current world before they get too far. City maintenance usually shows up, kills the weed and fills the fissures. But in the post-people world, there is no one left the continuously path New York. The weed are followed by the city's most prolific exotic species, the Chinese Alethtian trees. Even with the 8 million people around, Alethus, otherwise innocently known as the tree of the heaven, or implacable invaders capable of rooting in tiny chinks in a subway tunnel, unnoticed until their spreading leaf coniferas start poking from the sidewalk's grades. With no one to young their seedlings, within 5 years, powerful alethins roots are heaving up sidewalks and wreaking havoc in sewers, which are already stressed by all the plastic bags and the old newspaper mess that no one is clearing away. As soil long trapped beneath the pavement gets exposed to the sun and rain, other species jump in, and soon leaf litters adds to the rising piles of debris clogging the sewer grates. The early pioneer plants won't even have to wait for the pavement to fall apart. Starting from the mulch collections in the gutters, a layer of a soil will start forming atop New York's sterile hard shells, and seedling will sprout with far less organic material available to it. Just wind blown dust and urban shoot. Precisely that has happened in an abandoned elevated iron bed of an New York Central Railroad on Mahananda's west side. Since trains stopped running there in 1980s, the inevitable Aluthus trees have been joined by the thickening ground cover of an onion grass and fuzzy lamp ear, accented by the stands of an golden rock. In some places, the track emerges from the second stories of an warehouse it once serviced into elevated lanes of the wild courses irises, evening primroses, asters, and the Queen Anne's lace. So many New Yorkers glancing down from the window in Chesapeake art districts were moved by the sight of its untended, flowering green ribbon prodigiously and swiftly laying the claim to a dead slice of their city, that it was dubbed the Highline, unofficially designated a park. In the first few years, with no heat, pipes burst all over town. The freeze thaw cycles moves indoor and the thing starts to seriously deteriorate. Building grown as their innards expands and contrast. Joints between the walls and the roofline separates. Where they do, the rain leaks in bolt rust and facing the pops of exposing the installations. If the city hasn't burned yet, it will come now. Collectively, New York architecture isn't as constable as, says as San Francisco's integratory rows of an clubboard Victorians. But with no firemen to answer to call, a dry lighting strikes that ignites a decade of an dead branches, and leaving the piling up in Central Park will spread the flames through the city. Within 2 decades, lightning rods have begun to rust and snap, and the roof fires leap upon the building, entering a paneled offices filled with an paper fuel. Gas line ignites with a rush of an flames that blows out the window. Rain and in slope blows in, and soon even pour concentrate flows are freezing, thawing, and starting to buckle. Burnt insulation and charred wood add the nutrients to Manhattan's growing soil cap. Native Virginia creepers and the poison ivy claws at walls covered with the lynches which thrive in the absence of air pollution. Red-tailed hawks and peregrine falcons next in incredibly sketchy high-rise structures. Within 2 centuries, estimate the Brooklyn Botanical Garden Vice Presidents Stephen Clements colonizing the trees will have substantially replaced pioneer wheels. Gutters buried under the tons of a leaf lifters littler provider new. Fertile grounds for the native oaks and maple from a city parks. Arriving black lost and autumn olive shrubs fix nitrogens, allowing the sunflower, bustings, and the white snake roots to move in along with an apple trees. Their seeds expelled their seeds exhaled by the proliferating birds. Biodiversity will increase even more, predicts Copper Union Civil Engineering Chair Jamil Ahmad, as buildings tumble and smash into each other. Unlime from the crush, concentrate raise soil pH, inviting in trees such as buckthorn and bridge that needs less acidic environment. Ahmad, a hardly silvered hairman whose hand talks in descriptive circles, believed that progress will begin faster than people might think. A native of Lahore, Pakistan, a city of an ancient mosaic encrusted mosque, he now teaches how to design and retrofit the buildings to withstand terrorist attacks and has acquired a keen understanding of structural weakness. Even buildings anchored into hard mahogany sits. Like most New York skyscrapers, he notes, we weren't intended to have their steel foundation waterlogged. Plugged sewers, diluted tunnels, and the street reverting to the rivers, he says, will conspire to undermine sub-basements and destabilize their huge loads. In a future that portend stronger and more frequent hurricanes striking North America's Atlantic coast. Furious winds will pummel tall, unsteady structures. Some will topple, knocking down others, like a gap in the forest when a giant tree falls. New growth will rush in. Gradually, the afloat jungles will give way to real one. The New York's Botanical Garden, located on 250 acres across from the Bronx Zoo, possesses the largest herbarium anywhere outside Europe. Amongst its treasure are wildfield specimens gathered in as a Captain Cook in 1769, Pacific wandering and shred of Moses from Terra del Fuego, with accompanying notes written in an watery black ink and signed by its collector C. Darwin. Most remarkable thought is that NYBG's 40-acre tract of original, old-growth, virgin New York forest never looked, never cut, but might changed, until only recently it was known as the hemlock forest for its shady stands of that graceful conifer. But almost every hemlock here is now dead, slain by an Japanese insect smaller than the period at the end of their sentence, which arrived in New York in the mid of 1980s. The oldest and the biggest oaks during back to when this forest was British are also crashing down, their vigor capped by the acid rain and heavy metals such as lead from the automobiles and factory fumes, which have soaked into the soil. It's unlikely that they will come back because most canopy trees here long ago stopped regenerating. Every resident's native species now harbors its own pathogen. Some fungus, insects, or disease that seized the opportunity to ravage trees weakened by the chemical onslaught. As it is that we aren't enough, as the NYBG's forest became an island of greenery surrounded by the hundreds of square miles of grey urbanity. It becomes the primary refuge for bronze squirrel. With natural predators gone and no hunting permitted, there is nothing to stop them from devouring every acorn or hickory nuts before it can germinate, which they do. There is now an 8-decade gap in the older forest and story. Instead of the new generation of a native oaks, maple, ash, birch, sycamore, and the tulip trees, what's mainly growing are important ornaments that have blown in from the rest of their bogs. Soil samplings indicates some 20 million aluthinous seeds sprouting here. According to the chuck trees, Peters, Crouters of the lion alien seeds sprouting here. The NYBG's Institute of Economic Botany exhaust such as Alethisius and the cork trees, both from China, now accounts for more than a quarter of this forest. Some people want to put the forest back the way it was 200 years ago. He says, to that I tell them, you have got to put the Bronx back the way it was 200 years ago. As human beings learn to transport themselves all over the world, they took living things with them and brought back the others. Plants from the America changed not only ecosystem in European countries, but also their very identities. Think of an Ireland before potatoes, or Italy before tomatoes. In the opposite direction, old world invaders not only forced themselves on hapless women of vanquished new lands, but broadcast other kinds of a seed, beginning with the wheat, barley, and the rice. In a phrase coined by the American geography Alfred Crosby, this ecological imperialization helped European conquerors to permanently stamp the images on their colonies. Some bristles were ridiculous, like English gardens with the hyacinth and daffodils that never quite look whole in colonial India. In New York, the European sterlings, now an ubiquitous aviation's pet from Alaska to Mexico, was introduced because someone thought that the city would be more cultured in Central Park, where the home to each bird mentions in Shakespeare. Next came the Central Park garden is in with every plant in the bard's play, sown with a lyrical like of primroses, wormwoods, lark-heel, elegance, and cowslips, everything short of an Macbeth Brynan Woods. To what extent the Mahananda's project, virtual past, resembles the Mahananda's forest to come depends on a struggle for the North American soil that will continue long after the human that insisted it are gone. The NYBG's herbarium also hold one of the first American species of a deductively lovely lavender stalk. The seed of a purple loosestrife navigate to the northeast Equatorius from Britain to Finland, likely arrived in the wet sand that the merchant ship dug from European tidal flats as baselets for their Atlantic crossings. As trade with the colonies grew, more purple lost strife was dumped along American shores as ships jettisoned ballasts before taking on cargo. Once established, it moved up the streams and the river as its streets stuck to the muddy features of a fur of whatever it touched. In Hudson River wetland communities of cattail, willows, and a canary grass that fed and sheltered the waterflowers and muscats turned into the solid curtains of purple, impenetrable even to the wildlife. By the 21st century, purple loose strife was at a large even in Alaska, where panicked state ecologists fear it will fill entire marshes, driving out the ducks, geese, terns, and swans. Even before the Shakespeare's Garden, Central Park designers Olmsted and Walks have brought in 500,000 trees along with their 500,000 cubic yards to fill to the complete their improvised visions of nature, spicing up the island with exotia like an Parisian ironwoods, Asian kutras, cedars of Lebanon, and the Chinese royal palmiers and the gigongs. Yet when humans are gone, the native planets left to compete with an formidable contingent of an alien species in order to reclaim their birthright will have some ground advantages. Many foreign ornamentals, double roses, for example, will wither with the civilization that introduced them, because they are sterile hybrids that must propagate through the cuttings. When the gardeners that clone them go, so do they. Other pampered colonial like the English ivy left to fend for themselves, losses to their through the American cousins, Virginia creepers and the poison ivy. Still others are really mutations, forced by the highly selective breedings. If they survive at all, their forms and the presence will be diminished. Untainted fruits such as apple and imported from Russia and Kazakhstan, belaying the American Johnny Apple's myth. Selects for the hardness, not appearance nor taste, and turn grandly. Except for a few survivors, unspared apple orchard, defenseless against the Native American spurges, apple mangoes, and the leaf miner blights, will be reclaimed by the native hardwoods. Introduce the garden plot vegetables will revert to their humble beginning. Sweet carrots, originally Asian, quickly devolved to wild. Unpalatable queen annihilates as animals devour the last of the tasty orange one we planted, says New York Botanical Garden Vice President Dennis Stevenson. Broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and cauliflower regress to the same unrecognizable broccoli and sprouts and cauliflower regrets ancestors. Descendants of the sweet corn planted by the Dominicans in the Washington Heights Park away the medians may eventually retrace their DNA back to the original Mexican testinoid, its cob barely bigger than a sprig of wheat. The other invasion that has accosted natives, metals such as lead, mercury, and cadmium, will not wash quickly from the soil. because these are literally heavy molecules. One thing is certain, when cars have stopped for goods and factories go dark and stay that way. When cars have stopped for goods and the factories go dark and stay that way, no more such metals will be deposited. For the first 100 years or so, however, Coruscants will periodically set off the time bombs left in an petroleum tanks, chemical and the power plants, and hundreds of dry cleaners. Gradually, bacteria will feed on a residues of the fuels, laundry solvents and lubricants, reducing them to the more beginning organic hydrocarbons. Although a wide spectrum of an man-made novelistic ranging from certain pesticides to the plasticides to installers will linger for many millennia under the microbes evolved to process them. Yet with new acid-free rainfall, trees that still endure will have a fewer containment to resist as chemically are gradually flushed from the system. Over centuries, vegetation will take up decreasing levels of heavy metals and will recycle the redeposit and dilute them further. As plants die, decay, and lay down more soil cover, the industrial toxins will be buried deeper and each succeeding crop of native seedlings will do better. And although many of New York's hairline loom, trees are endangered if not actually dying. Few, if any, are already existent. Even the deeply mourned American cashew nut, devastated everywhere after a fungal blight entered New York around 1900 in a shipment of Asian nursery plants, still hangs on it in the New York Botanical Garden Old Forest. Literally, but it roots. It sprouts, send out shinky shots 2 feet high, gets knocked back by the blight, and does it again. One day, perhaps, with no human stressors sapping its vigor, or resistant strain will finally emerge. Once the tallest hardwood in the American eastern forest, that reconstruct the cashew nut trees would have to coexist with the robust non-natives that are probably here to stay. Japanese barberry, oriental bittersweet, and surely ailanthus. The ecosystem here will be human artifact that will persist in our absence. A cosmopolitan botanical mixture that would never have occurred without us. Which may not be bad, suggested New York Botanical Garden Chuck Peters. What makes New York a great city now is its cultural diversity. Everyone has something to offer, but botanically we are exophobic. We long native spices and want aggressive exotic plants species to go home. He props his running shoes against the whitest bark of Chinese armor crook tree, growing among the last of an hemlocks. This sounds blasphemous, but maintaining biodiversity is less important than maintaining a functional ecosystem. What matters is that the soil is protected, the water gets cleaned, the trees filters the air, that the canopy regenerated the new seedlings to keep the nutrient from draining away into the Bornyx River. He inhales a lungful of filtered Bornyx air, trim and youthful in his earlier 50s. Peter has spent much of his life in the forest. His field research have revealed that the pockets of a wind plum nuts trees deep in the Amazon or of durian fruits trees in virgin Borneo or of tea trees in Burma jungles aren't accidents. One humans were there too. The wilderness swallowed them and their memory, but its shapes still bears their echo. As well, this one, in fact, it has done so nice soon after Homo sapiens appears here. Eric Sanderson Mahahanta's project is recreating the island as the Dutch found it. Not some primordial Mahadantan's forest no human had set foot on, because there wasn't one. Because before the Lenny Lapins arrived, explaining the Sanderson, nothing was here except for a mile thick slab of ice. About 11,000 years ago, as the last ice age receded the northward from the Mahadantan, it pulled along the Spur and the Tarmic taiga that today grows just below the Canadian tundra. In its place came what we know as the temperature eastern forest of North America: oak, hickory, chestnut, walnut, hemlock, elm, beech, sugar maple, sweet gum, sapphires, and the wild fiblets. In the clearing grew shrubs of an chokecherry, fragment sumac, rhododendron, honeysuckle, an assorted fence, and the flowering plants. Sprantina and the rose mallow appeared in the salt marbles. As all this foliage filled these warning niches, warm-blooded animals followed, including the humans. A dread of archaeological remains suggests that the first New Yorkers probably didn't settle, but camped seasonally to pick berries, chestnuts, and the wild grapes. They hunted turkey, heath hens, ducks, and the white-tailed deers, but mainly they fished the surrounding waters, swam with the smelt, shad, and herrings. Broadthroat ran in Mahananda's stream. Oysters, clams, hawks, crabs, and lobsters were so abundant that harvesting them was effortless. Large middens of discarded mollusk shells along the shore were the first human structures here. By the time Henry Hudson first saw the island, Upper Halman and the Greenwich village were grassy savannas, cleared repeatedly with the fire by Lenny Limits for planting. By flooding ancient Harmel fire pits to see what floats to the top. Mahananda's project, researchers have learned that the Lenny Leptis cultivated corn, bean, squash, and sunflowers. Much of the island was still as green as the dense as the Biolowieza pucasa, but well before it is famous, transfiguring from the Indian land to colonial real estate. Priced to sell at 60 Dutch guilders, the mark of Homo sapiens was already on Mahantan. In the millennium year 2000, a harbinger of a future that might revive the past appeared in the form of coyote that managed to reach the Central Park. Subsequently, two more made it into town, as well as wild turkey. The rewilding of the New York City may not wait until people leave. The first advance of Coyote Scott arrived via the George Washington Bridge, with Jeffrey Del Tufo managed for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Later, he took over the bridges that link the Staten Island to the mainland and the Long Land. A structural engineer in his 40s, he considered bridges among the loftiest ideas human ever conceived, gratefully spinning gems to bring the people together. Del Tufo himself spans an ocean. His olive features bespeak Silicy. His voice is pure urban New Jersey, bred to the pavement and the steel that became his life's work. He none other than less marvel to the annual miracle of a baby Prigine falcon hazing high at the top the new Washington's tower, and at the sheer botanical odyssey of a grass, weed, and an alitaceous trees that defiantly bloom. Far from the topsoil, from the metal niches suspended high above the water, his bridges are under a constant guerrilla assaults by nature. Its Ashland and the Tupers may seem ludicrously funny against the steel plated arm, but it ignores endlessly ubiquitous bird dropping that can snag and sprout airborne seeds and simultaneously dissolve paint would be fatal. Del Tufo is up against a primitive but unrelenting fear whose ultimate strength is that ability to overlast its adversary, and he accepts as fact that ultimately nature must win. Not on his watch, though it he can help it. First and the foremost, he honored the legacy he and his crew inherited. Their bridges were built by a generation of engineering who couldn't possibly have conceived of a third of an millennium car crossing them daily. Yet 80 years later, they are still in the service. Our job, he tells his men, is to hand over these treasures to the next generation in better shape than we have accepted them. On a February afternoon, he heads through snow flurries to the Bayonne Bridge, chatting with his crew over his radio. The underside of approach on the Staten Island side is a powerful steel matrix that converge in a huge concentrate block anchored to the bedrock, an abutment that bears half the road of an Bayonne's main span. To stare up directly into its labyrinthine load bearing I-beams and bracing members interlocked with a half-inch thick steel plates, flagons, and a several million half-inch rivets, and the bolts recalls the crushing of that humble pilgrims gaping at the soaring Vatican dome of St. Peter's Cathedral. Something this might is here forever. Yet Jerry Del Tufo knows exactly how these bridges, without the human to defend to them, would come down. It wouldn't happen immediately because the most immediate threat will disappear with us. It is not, say, due to for the innocent pounding traffic. These bridges are so overbuilt, the traffic's like an ant on an elephant. In the 1930s, with no computers to precisely calculate the tolerance of the construction material, caution engineers simply heaped on excess, mass, and redundancy. We were living off the overcapacity of our forefathers. The GW alone has enough galvanized steel wire in its 3-inch main cables to wrap the earth 4 times. Even if every other suspenders rope dictated the bridge wouldn't fall down. Enemy numbers 1 is the salt that highway departments spread on the roadways each winter. Ranish stuff that keeps eating steel once it dons with the ice. Oil, antifreeze, and the snow melts dripping from the car wash, salt into the cat basins and crevices were maintained. Crews must find a flush it. With no more people, there won't be salt. There will be, however, be rust and a quiet and a bit of it. When no one is painting the bridges, at first oxidation forms a coating on a steel plate, twice as thick as more as the metal itself, which slows the pace of chemical attack. For steel to the completely rust through and fall apart might take centuries, but it won't be necessary to wait the long for New York's bridges to start drooping. The reason is a metallic version of the free throw drama. Rather than crack like a concentrate, steel expands when it warms and contracts when it cools, so that the steel bridges can actually get longer in summer. They need expansion joints. In winter, when they shrink, the space inside the expansion joints open wider and stuff blows in. Whenever it does, there is a less room for the bridge to expand when things warms up. With no one painting bridges, joints fill not only with the debris but also with the rust, which swells to occupy far more space than the original metal. Come summer, says Del Tufo, the bridge is going to get bigger whether you like it or not. If the expansion joint is collaged, it expands towards the weakest link, like where two different material connects. He points to where few and four lanes of a street meets the concentrate abutment. There, for example, the concentrate could crack where the beam is bolted to the pier, or after a few sessions, the bolt could shear off. Eventually, the beam could walk itself right off and fall. Every connection is vulnerable. Rust that forms between the two steel plates blotted together exacts force so extreme that either the plates bend or rifts pop, says Del Tufo. Arch bridges like the Bayonne or the Hell Gates over the East River made to hold the railroads are the most overbuilt of all. They might hold for the next 1,000 years, although the earthquake rippling through one of several falls under the coastal plain could shorten that period. They would probably do better than the 14 steel lined concentrate subways, tubes beneath the East River, one of which, leading to the Brookline, dates back to the horses and buggies. Should any of their sections separate, the Atlantic Ocean would rush in. The suspension and the truss bridges that carry the automobile, however, will last only 2 or 3 centuries before the rivulet and the bowls fail and entry's section falls into the waiting water. Until then, more coyotes follow the footsteps of the interpretant ones that manage to reach the Central Park. Deer, bear, and finally wolves will have re-entered New England from Canada, arrived in turn by the time most of its bridges are gone. Manhattan's new building has also been ravaged. As everywhere leak reach the embedded steel, reinforming the bars, they rust, expand, and burst the concentrate that sheathed them. Older stone buildings such as Grand Central, especially with no more acid rains, to poke their marbles will outland every shiny modern box. Rains of an high rise echo the love songs of the frogs breeding in Mahadanta's recontinued streams, now stocked with an alewives and mussels dropped by the seagulls. Huron and Shad have returned to the Hudson, though they spent some generation adjusting to radioactivity trickling out of an Indian Point nuclear power plant 35 miles north of Times Square after its reuniformed concentrate spumbled. Missing, however, or nearly all the fauna adapts to us. The slimly inviolable cockroach, a tropical important long ago France, is unheated apartment buildings. Without garbage, rats trapped or became lunch for the raptors nesting in burnt out the skyscrapers. Rising water tides and salt corrosions have replaced the engineered shorelines circling the New York's five brewed with extrusives and small beaches. With no dreading, Central Park spawns and receivers have been reincarnated as marshes. Without natural gazers, unless horses used by the Hanson cabs and by the park policemen manage to go feral and breed. Central Park grass is gone. A maturing forest isn't in its place, radiating down former streets and invading empty foundations. Coyotes, wolves, red foxes, and bobcats have brought squirrels back into the balance with the oak trees, tough enough to outlast the lead we deposited. And after 500 years, even in an warming climate, the oaks, beeches, and the moisture loving species such as ash dominates. Thank you.